In 2014, the former wife of Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah staged a protest outside the Saudi embassy in London. She called for the release of her 4 adult daughters, who their father's orders had imprisoned. The sisters' situation in Saudi Arabia was dire. They were starved, humiliated, and sedated. What fate awaited the 4 Saudi princesses? What happened to them 10 years later? The full truth has finally been revealed. Watch the video until the end to uncover the horrifying details of this story. The story of the 4 Saudi princesses shook the world 10 years ago. Their father, King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, ruled Saudi Arabia for 10 years and was worth an estimated $15 billion. He was an incredibly powerful and wealthy figure. Known as a reformer, he was celebrated for granting women more rights and freedoms in Saudi Arabia. For example, he allowed women to join the Consultative Council, gave them access to higher education, and expanded their ability to work in previously closed sectors. While some of the most visible changes came later, Abdullah's reforms laid the groundwork for transforming women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Yet when it came to his own family, the image of a reformer vanished, replaced by one of a tyrant. The king kept his 4 adult daughters imprisoned in a private villa for over a decade. This was no golden cage. It was a real prison. The sisters were deprived of food and water and subjected to harsh treatment, including being force-fed heavy sedatives. What could have driven the king to such cruelty? Why would a man known for championing women's rights punish his own daughters so severely? To understand this, we must first delve into the story of their mother, a woman who herself once dared to challenge the authority of the royal court. The mother of 4 princesses, Al-Anaud Al-Fayez, was born in 1957 into a prominent family in Jordan. She is the daughter of one of the sheikhs of the Al-Fayez clan from Bani Sakhr, a well-known and influential tribe. When Al-Anaud was just 15 years old, her parents arranged for her to marry King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, who was around 50 years old at the time. It was, without a doubt, an arranged marriage with no room for love or personal choice. Al-Anaud had never even seen her husband before the day of their wedding. How could she love a man old enough to be her grandfather? This story reflects the grim reality for many young girls in the Arab world, where family alliances and tribal politics often take precedence over the well-being and agency of the bride. It is a tragic and deeply unjust practice, forcing teenage girls to marry elderly men in the name of tradition or social agreements. At the time of their marriage, King Abdullah already had multiple wives and a growing family. He had around 30 wives and fathered 36 children throughout his life. Each wife and their children were often confined to separate palaces or villas, rarely interacting with one another. Despite his public image as a reformer within the royal household, Abdullah maintained the deeply patriarchal structure that governs Saudi Arabia's royal family. For Al-Anaud, her marriage was not just a union devoid of love, but the beginning of a life of isolation and hardship. After her wedding, Al-Anaud Al-Fayez resigned herself to her fate. She lived surrounded by unimaginable wealth in a vast and opulent palace, yet her heart remained unfulfilled. Over the years, she gave birth to 4 daughters: Princess Jawahar, Princess Hala, Princess Maha, and Princess Sahar. These girls became the light of her life, her sole source of joy in a world where she felt increasingly trapped. Despite the luxurious surroundings, Al-Anaud was never truly happy. Her husband, King Abdullah, had a despotic nature, ruling over his household with the same authority he wielded as a monarch. It was nearly impossible for her to love him, especially given the circumstances of their marriage and the vast differences in their ages and personalities. The turning point in their relationship came when the king realized that Al-Anaud could only bear him daughters and not a single son. Like many Eastern monarchs of his time, King Abdullah placed immense value on male heirs, despite already having several sons from his other wives. To him, sons represented power, legacy, and continuity, while daughters were considered less desirable, regardless of their accomplishments. This failure to provide him with additional male heirs enraged the king. Al-Anud fell out of favor, and Abdullah turned his attention to his numerous other wives and mistresses. Their relationship deteriorated further, and he eventually stopped living with her altogether. It is possible that Abdullah divorced her after the birth of their fourth daughter. However, Al-Anud may not have even been aware of the divorce at the time. In Saudi Arabia during that period, a man could legally divorce his wife without informing her, leaving the woman in a state of uncertainty and powerlessness. Al-Anud's life was a paradox. While she lived in a palace filled with riches, she faced emotional neglect and the harsh reality of being discarded by a husband who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for producing sons. Her daughters became her only solace in a life that offered everything material but little love or respect. When Princesses Jawahir, Hala, Maha, and Sahar were young, they enjoyed all the privileges of royal life and basked in unimaginable luxury. Their upbringing was nothing short of a fairy tale. They received an excellent education, traveled the world, stayed in five-star hotels, vacationed at exclusive resorts, and dressed in the finest designer clothes. Their days were filled with comfort, and their lives seemed like a dream to outsiders. However, in Saudi Arabia, the reality for women, even those born into royalty, has always been marked by dependence on their male guardians. Under the country's guardianship laws, women required permission from a male guardian, be it a father, brother, husband, or even a son, for almost every aspect of their lives. They could only study, work, travel abroad, open a bank account, or access medical care with their guardian's approval. Their father, King Abdullah, acted as their guardian for the princesses. Despite his strictness in other areas, he granted them significant freedom during their childhood and spared no expense in ensuring they lived a life of abundance. Given his immense wealth, valued in the billions, this generosity was hardly surprising. The sisters never had to worry about earning a living or planning their financial future. Everything was provided for them. But this life of privilege came with an invisible price. Complete dependency on their father meant they had to adhere to his rules and decisions without question. The king's word was absolute, and the princesses were expected to obey him in all matters. They had no control over their lives, no matter how privileged they seemed to outsiders. In 2003, Al-Anud Al-Fayez, no longer able to endure life in a gilded cage with a husband she did not love, made the bold decision to flee the country. With the help of a women's rights organization, she boarded a flight to London, leaving behind the palace and her life in Saudi Arabia for good. Settling in the UK, she found solace in her newfound freedom and hoped that one day her daughters could join her. Leaving her 4 daughters was one of Al-Anud's hardest decisions. By that time, however, the sisters were fully grown and independent women who no longer required the constant care of their mothers. Al-Anud believed that as daughters of the king, they were safe and protected. After all, their father had always been generous to them, granting them freedoms and privileges. She could not have imagined what was to come. When King Abdullah learned of her escape, his reaction was swift and furious. Despite having long since abandoned their marriage and focused on his other wives and mistresses, he still considered Al-Anud his property. The very idea that she had taken control of her own life, making such a drastic decision without his permission, was a direct affront to his authority. His ego was wounded, and his anger was uncontrollable. But Abdullah knew where to strike to hurt her most. He was fully aware of how much Al-Anud loved her daughters. In his rage, he vowed to punish her by targeting them. "They will die slowly and painfully," he reportedly declared, showing the extent of his wrath. Immediately after her departure, the king revoked the sisters' passports, stripping them of the ability to travel or seek refuge elsewhere. He ordered them under strict house arrest, confined to a private villa. What had once been their home now became their prison. This was no idle punishment. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for over a decade. King Abdullah had another deeper reason for placing his 4 daughters under house arrest and isolating them from the outside world. As they grew older, the princesses began asking uncomfortable questions about the state of affairs in Saudi Arabia. Highly educated, intelligent, and compassionate, they could not remain silent about their observed injustices. They advocated for human rights, justice, and equality. Taboo topics in a monarchy where dissent was crushed swiftly and mercilessly. One of the most outspoken sisters was Princess Hala. While working as an intern at a hospital in Riyadh, she made a shocking discovery. In the psychiatric ward, she found political prisoners who were being forcibly sedated, punished with heavy medication simply for expressing opinions that differed from the government's narrative. Horrified, Princess Hala spoke out, calling the authorities to address this gross injustice. She raised her voice to defend those who had none, determined to bring attention to the inhumane treatment she had witnessed. Her actions, however, did not sit well with the king. For Abdullah, any criticism of the government, even from his own daughter, was intolerable. His response was swift and brutal. He ordered Princess Hala to be arrested and sent to a women's prison in the desert. Her confinement served as a chilling warning to her sisters, who also began to face consequences for their growing dissent. The other sisters, Princesses Jawahir, Maha, and Sahar, were equally vocal about the issues plaguing Saudi society. They questioned their father about the rampant poverty in a country so rich in oil, asking why so many citizens struggled to make ends meet while the royal family enjoyed unimaginable luxury. No matter how valid their criticisms were, they were met with denial and anger. As punishment for their rebellious behavior, all 4 sisters, Princesses Jawahir, Hala, Maha, and Sahar, were placed under house arrest in a royal villa. Initially, their situation, though restrictive, was not unbearable. They were allowed limited outings under the strict supervision of guards and had access to the internet, which enabled them to maintain contact with the outside world and their mother, Al-Anud. However, as the sisters continued to resist their confinement and share details about their treatment with the world, their conditions began to deteriorate. The king, furious over their defiance, imposed harsher and harsher restrictions. They were deprived of food and water for extended periods, denied medical care, and forcibly sedated with heavy medications to subdue their spirits and voices. Sometimes they were physically abused and insulted by their half-brothers. By 2005, Al-Anud grew increasingly alarmed about her daughter's well-being. She feared for their lives, knowing how far the king would go to silence them. She refused to remain passive despite being thousands of miles away in London. In 2014, Al-Anud took her fight to the global stage. She began pleading with the international community for help. She staged protests outside the Saudi Arabian embassy in London, holding signs and demanding her daughter's release. She penned a heartfelt letter to then U.S. President Barack Obama, urging him to use his influence to pressure the Saudi government. Additionally, she gave interviews to various media outlets, shedding light on the plight of her daughters and the injustices they faced. But what did Al-Anud manage to accomplish? Was she able to help her daughters? Unfortunately, the answer is a painful reminder of the world's indifference. While the West expressed outrage over the princess's unjust treatment and sympathized with the plight of women in Saudi Arabia, their response was, as always, steeped in hypocrisy. Despite vocal condemnations, no real action was taken to help the sisters. Western governments and corporations continued to buy Saudi oil, maintain lucrative business partnerships, and prop up the very regime responsible for such repression. When Saudi officials were confronted about the situation, their response was chillingly indifferent. "This is a private matter," they declared, dismissing the sisters' suffering as if it were of no concern to the outside world. With that, the doors to any meaningful intervention were firmly shut. For the next decade, a veil of secrecy surrounded the fate of the king's daughters. All information about them was tightly controlled, and no one could determine what had become of them. Speculation and whispers circulated, but no concrete details emerged. It seemed as though the sisters had been erased from the public eye, their existence confined to the shadows of the palace walls. It wasn't until recently that the truth finally came to light. After years of silence, the horrifying reality of what happened to Princesses Jawahar, Hala, Maha, and Sahar was revealed. In 2024, Dr. Dwight Burdick, who had worked for many years with the Saudi royal family and treated the four princesses, finally revealed the full truth in an interview with The New Yorker. His story shed light on the harrowing conditions endured by Princesses Jawahar, Hala, Maha, and Sahar during their years of captivity. Dr. Burdick had arrived in Saudi Arabia from Texas in the mid-1990s with his wife. Bored with the routine of his job at a Texas hospital and enticed by the promise of a substantial salary, he sought a new adventure in the Middle East. He became a physician for the Saudi royal family, a position that offered prestige and financial rewards. For years, Burdick and his wife immersed themselves in Saudi culture, even converting to Islam, genuinely believing in the country's traditions and values. However, they remained oblivious to the darker truths hidden within the royal household. It wasn't until around 2008 that Dr. Burdick learned about the imprisoned princesses. He was summoned to Princess Hala's quarters with an unsettling request to sedate her forcibly. Shocked and appalled, Burdick refused to administer sedatives against a patient's will, as it violated his ethical principles as a doctor. Determined to understand the situation and help if he could, he requested permission to meet the sisters. What he found horrified him. Princesses Hala and Maha, in particular, were heavily dependent on alcohol and illicit substances, addictions that were the result of years of forced sedation and trauma. These substances were not just made available to them, but were often imposed as a means of control. The sisters lived under constant surveillance, their every move monitored by cameras and listening devices. The oppressive environment had left them in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. Dr. Burdick soon discovered that Hala and Maha often had outbursts, their frustration and despair boiling over into aggressive behavior. In these instances, palace staff would summon medical personnel to sedate the sisters. During his first visit to Princess Hala's quarters, Burdick was met with hostility. Overwhelmed by anger and mistrust, she attacked him with a knife. However, instead of retaliating or complying with orders to sedate her, Burdick chose to speak to her calmly. This interaction left a deep impression on him. He saw not just anger, but desperation in her eyes, and he understood that these women were victims of a system designed to break their spirits. While he could do little to change their situation, Burdick continued to visit the sisters, offering medical care and emotional support whenever he could. Dr. Dwight Burdick, fully aware of Princesses Hala and Maha's dire state, knew they needed professional treatment to overcome their addiction. He began devising a plan to help them regain their health and ultimately their freedom. His idea was bold. He proposed sending Hala and Maha to a rehabilitation center in California, one of the best in the world. He hoped that their siblings, Jawahar and Sahar, could eventually join them once the two sisters were safely abroad. However, the royal court immediately rejected his proposal. Officials curtly informed him that the sisters would never be allowed to leave Saudi Arabia and warned him that continuing to press the issue would put his own safety at risk. The message was clear. Any attempt to help the sisters escape their confinement would not be tolerated. Realizing that he could not defy the powerful regime without endangering himself and his wife, Dr. Burdick abandoned his plan for their escape and resolved to help the princesses as best he could within the confines of their captivity. With his guidance and support, Princess Hala managed to overcome her dependency on alcohol and illicit substances. Her progress was remarkable, and for the first time in years, she began to dream of a life beyond the palace walls. Hala's hope for freedom grew stronger, and she believed that with her father's permission, she might one day leave Saudi Arabia to start anew. Encouraged by her recovery, Dr. Burdick helped arrange a meeting between Hala and her father, King Abdullah. Over a formal dinner, Hala presented her case. She told the king about her recovery, renewed purpose, and desire to travel abroad. She asked for his permission to go to Italy, where she hoped to build a new life. King Abdullah listened to her carefully, but his response was as calculated as it was dismissive. He told Hala that her request would only be considered under one condition. She must first marry a Saudi Muslim man of his choosing. Only after fulfilling this requirement, he said, would he entertain the idea of granting her permission to leave the country? Hala was devastated. She knew this was not a genuine offer, but a way to keep her under his control. Marriage to a man chosen by her father would only tighten the chains of her captivity. Without hesitation, she refused his condition, reaffirming her desire for independence. After their mother, Alanud Al-Fayez, raised global awareness about her daughter's plight in 2014, the situation for the four princesses took a dramatic turn. In retaliation for the unwanted attention, their captors began treating them even more cruelly. The sisters were sometimes deprived of food and had their water supply cut off for extended periods as a form of punishment. Unable to stand by and watch them suffer, Dr. Dwight Burdick, who still had access to the royal compound, took it upon himself to help. Since he wasn't thoroughly searched, he secretly collected leftovers from the king's table and smuggled them to the sisters. The scraps of food became vital for their survival during the harshest periods of their captivity. To ensure they could no longer reach out for help, the women were stripped of all means of communication. Their phones, internet access, and any form of outside contact were taken away. Isolated and silenced, they were left entirely at their father's and his guards' mercy. Realizing the worsening situation, Dr. Burdick and his wife concluded they could no longer help the sisters. The oppressive environment and threats to their safety left them with no choice but to leave Saudi Arabia and return to the United States. Before their departure, they arranged one final visit with Princess Maha. The sight of her shocked them to their core. Her hair had nearly fallen out, her body was swollen from malnutrition or medications, and her mental state was deeply disturbed. The vibrant young woman they once knew had been reduced to a shadow of herself. King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud passed away in 2015, yet even after his death, the sisters remained imprisoned. Before his passing, the king reportedly vowed that the women would never be released, ensuring their continued captivity even beyond his lifetime. In 2021, years after leaving Saudi Arabia, Dr. Burdick learned heartbreaking news from friends who still worked there. Princess Hala had passed away from an unnamed chronic illness. The royal court announced her death, but offered no further details, leaving the circumstances in mystery. 6 months later, Princess Maha also died. This time, the palace didn't even release an official statement. Her death was briefly mentioned on social media by a humanitarian foundation linked to King Abdullah. The fate of the two remaining sisters, Princesses Jawahar and Sahar, remains unknown. It is believed they are still held in confinement in Saudi Arabia, but there is also the haunting possibility that they may no longer be alive. The lack of information surrounding their lives only deepens the mystery and tragedy of their situation. Their mother, Al-Anud Al-Fayez, lives in London, hoping she might see at least one of her daughters again. Despite the many years of silence and uncertainty, she refuses to give up on them. Do you think such a reunion is possible? This story highlights the harsh reality of living under a repressive regime where women have no rights or freedom. Even princesses, the daughters of a king, are silenced and stripped of their voices. What chance, then, do ordinary women have? If this story moves you, please share your thoughts in the comments, like this video, and subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you for watching.